Good. Thank you very much, both of you, for some very interesting papers, both in progress, but both with quite promising and interesting aspects as so far regarding the understanding of what this actually means. Because we can say so much about these practices and these technologies and these different media platforms, but what does it actually mean to people? And what strikes me when, and I think that the two papers are put very well together here, because in some respects they are contradictory. And in some respects you can say that I believe you are actually both right. I believe you actually have some very have caught some very important aspects of this, but also that the two papers put together illustrates that this is a very complex field, that it's a field where both can be true at the same time. Maybe not for the same person, but maybe for the same person, but just at different parts of their lives, and in different social relations and so on. So what I would actually like to start by asking is the two of you, what you think when you hear the other person giving their talk, and how these contradictories and how these ambiguities are also maybe present in some of your work. That on one hand, people are sharing, seeing themselves through the gaze of other people, maybe or maybe not being influenced by this. But on the other hand, people want to be alone with their data, and they just want to use them for quite private purposes. So how can this be? I don't know if you want to start.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and it kind of makes me think of, we talked about a little bit earlier, if tracking was just a phase, and I think what both of our presentations kind of highlight is that, for example, from my point of view, the informants the participants I talked about today, they're in a very early stage of starting to exercise, and for them it's a very private thing. And what I didn't tell was that some of the other participants I have who have been exercising for their whole lives, they have other kinds of sharing practices, and they have also been through some sort of journey in which they started out with tracking as a very private thing, and the media use as a very private thing, with a very limited social network on the tracking apps. And then this sort of, as they get more and more comfortable with the exercise practice, their usage also evolves, so they start to share, mostly with in different kinds of ways. So I think you can see sort of in the practice sort of evolves.
Yeah, I think for my work, I think it depends on what kind of user you're looking at. And I'm not focusing on just exercise. I'm more interested in looking at health practice as a whole. And I'm interested in tying in lifestyle into health and how different things are now becoming representative of health practice. So sharing an Instagram image, or even talking on Facebook about how you're feeling one day if you're tired or stressed, to sharing data or improvements in your running, for example. So I think in that regard, it depends what kind of user you're looking at and what information they're sharing and why. And my participants that were trying to optimize or improve, ones that were training for a marathon or trying to lose weight, were only willing to share, only willing to be public about that information once they'd hit a certain point of optimization, once they were able to feel that they were represent this idealized self that they were striving towards, even though it all, that's a constant cycle, that cycle never ends. So I think it just depends who you're looking at to do with the different levels of kind of exposure and self-censorship in terms of what people are sharing and what they're keeping private.
What I also experienced during the interviews, is that there's a certain sort of normativity regarding what is okay to share on social media, and many of the participants were quite. They all said that milestones are sort of the thing that you are allowed to share, but you're not allowed to share every single run on, for example, Facebook or Twitter. So even though it might only be 2 kilometers or 3 kilometers, you are allowed to share this on Facebook if it's a sort of a milestone to you. And that struck me that they were all kind of agreeing on that. My participants, even though it was individual interviews, so they didn't talk to each other and stuff.
Yeah, there seems to be this real kind of etiquette that's evolving from oversharing, that is pushing people. That's kind of pushing them to share or not share certain information on how much they're sharing and why, because there seems to be this real stigma now that's attached to oversharing. I think we're entering this kind of new phase of social media where initially we all went on and we were sharing everything about our lives, and thankfully that horrible memories thing that pops up all the time reminds you of all the oversharing that everyone's done over the years. And now there's this kind of idea that no, you have to be very careful about what you're sharing and why. And I think and that's what I meant about being conscious about what's public and private now, is that people are aware of what information's going out there and why, and the etiquettes that are associated with that as well, I think.
Well, that was actually one of the questions I would like to ask you, because of some of the examples that you had here. You had this very nice example about this guy. I just pictured a colleague coming up to him and saying, "Hey, why didn't you post your run yesterday? Weren't you out running yesterday?" And you could, I don't know how the words fell at the time, but it could also be an ironic statement. Whoa, you forgot to post. You were just. But how did you see these changes? Because yes, I assume there is quite a change, and yes, Facebook are definitely reminding us that there is quite a change in the way that we're using these social media, and maybe it also has to do with different generations using different social media for different purposes and doing it in different ways. But did any of your informants talk about these issues also?
Yeah, they kind of. As I kind of mentioned before, it was once you're reaching these milestones, that seems to kind of legitimate what you can share and why. But with that participant in particular, he wasn't even a colleague. He was actually like a acquaintance, someone he'd met from a friend of a friend, and he'd privately messaged him on Facebook. So it wasn't even like somebody he was meeting face to face. No. He wasn't a passing comment in the hallway at work or anything like that. It was he actively went onto Facebook and sent him a private message, and he hadn't spoken or heard from this friend acquaintance for many years, which I found fascinating, that he kind of had the guts to question why he hadn't done the run, and he had, but he suddenly felt this weird sense of being surveyed by the community, but the imagined community. So yeah, I think it's I think there is a generational divide, definitely. I think that the younger generations seem to be far more aware of the impact of the representation, in terms of whether that's just internalised, they're kind of very hyper-conscious and concerned about how they're going to be perceived by the wider community. Whereas I found, this is generalisations at this point, and it's very early on in the study, but the elder generations were happy just to share this information, and were far more relaxed about the information that they were sharing.
And as you're saying, you're at an early phase in this study, but what you have been talking about was also how these practices may influence their lifestyle choices in their offline life. Do you have any ideas where this part of the analysis will take you, or have you talked to people about that? Have you had any also similar to the things that Joeb has been talking about the more sensory experiences of making lifestyle choices in a broad sense?
Yeah, definitely. It was the nudges and the devices, and that's coming particularly from the actual health applications itself. So things like Night Plus and Map My Run, those were the devices that were making the users feel that they should be, they're reminding, they should be going for runs, they should be calorie counting, or, if they have an input in their X amount of calories per day versus their kind of exercise expenditure, that they were being pushed by the device to manage that. But I also think that when you're talking about just the self-presentation on social media, so not necessarily the actual health technology itself, the perception from the wider community it was an influence as well when they were seeing other people, whether it was trying to lose weight or talking about going for a run, or even just images of people posting salads or healthy dinners that they're having. I think that puts people within the space where is a health community there. There's a consciousness where people are going, oh, well, I feel like I should be doing that too. And so there is that kind of underlying moralism that it seems to be occurring within the online communities, and not just, my argument is not just within health communities, so not just within the actual apps itself, but within social media. It's enabling these kind of new communities to evolve, but ones that aren't necessarily talked about. It's not a forum set up. So it can be quite internalised, these kind of pressures that the users are feeling.
Yeah, and probably also because the community is bigger than the people who are actually posting things on social media, and has influence on more people, like in different ways. I was thinking about a little bit more about the more sensory and the more emotional aspects in both of your presentations. You also said, Rachael, at one point that the devices can't capture the emotional status of a person. They do try to do so. I have a tracker in my phone who asks me how I'm doing, if it measures my pulse, or in some way they say they measure my stress level, and then they ask me how I'm feeling in relation to that. And also, of course, Facebook has this: how are you feeling? Are you frustrated? Are you happy? Are you whatever? So they do try to capture your emotional status. And you talk a lot about how emotions and ambiguities and frustrations are sort of being either suppressed or accentuated through the use of digital technologies. In your case, in the actual exercise practice, and in your case, perhaps more on an overall everyday life level. But I don't know if any of you want to elaborate a little bit more on the things about.
Yeah, what this I'm starting to think about method when you say that, and that is because I've been struggling a bit with how to get at this experience. How do we research people's practices of media use, and especially when you're dealing with such a thing such as smartphones and small wearables and stuff, because a lot of the usage is sort of embedded in our bodily way of. It's not something that we think a lot about. We're just doing it, and how do we get people to reflect on what they're doing in this sense? It's very much. I'm not sure how to explain it, but it's a very bodily way of using media that is maybe not that reflective, or that people are not that reflective about compared to other kinds of usage. Maybe because what I've experienced is that the interviews that I've made, they are decontextualized from the practice itself. It's not, and it's very difficult to go on a run with someone and ask them, what are you feeling? Because then you're starting to ruining the practice that they are experiencing. So
because you have trouble breathing yourself.
So how do we research this experience? Because you can't do it while they're running, but you can't really do it after either. And you can't go to the gym and stalk someone running on a treadmill, and because it's creepy, first of all, and second of all, because you can't see what is actually taking place on the screen, and third of all, because that doesn't say anything about what the way they're relating to the device and the data that they are tracking. So that is kind of a methodological problem, or
Yeah, I completely agree. They're trying to engage the users to be reflexive about their practice is so hard, because even a lot of the initial interviews I was doing were just trying to engage the users and just to talk about health practice, what they actually thought was health practice. And a lot of them didn't really couldn't identify that in their own minds. And then I would ask them, well, why are you using these technologies? You know, just initially, what are you doing this for? What are you trying to get out of it? And not one single person could give me an answer to that question. So they're obviously getting something out of it, and it's this kind of acquisition of data, and they like seeing the fancy leaderboards, and they like the feedback from the social media communities. So I guess it's a gratification of the evidence of data. But yeah, it's a methodological issue in terms of how do you actually get them to engage on a reflexive level. And so I've used guided reflexive diaries before in my master's work with interviews to try and contextualise the interviews, and getting them to do that on the days when they are practicing their health, whatever that may be, whether that's sharing content or going for a run, just to try and understand from a self-representational point what they're sharing, why they're sharing it, and how it's with the community feedback, how that's then making them feel offline. But it seems so commonsensical and mundane for a lot of them, so it's trying to engage them in those practices that they're just doing anyway, and they're not actually thinking why they're doing it.
And you're actually only talking to people who are sharing stuff, who are using these technologies. Not necessarily, no, because that would be another issue. How do you measure? How do you talk about the non-users or the followers? So
that's why I'm interested in looking at just how an everyday person uses it. It's not people that are necessarily managing particular illness or trying to train for a marathon or lose weight. It's more about how the everyday person is using it, because I think silences are interesting. We were discussing this briefly over lunch. You know, when people aren't sharing, but they're still on these sites, they're still watching other people. Why are they doing that? But they're not like publicly feeding back, obviously. And I think it's interesting, why certain people aren't sharing this information. I think that needs to kind of be looked into. But then it's very hard to identify the silences and explore that in that way.
But I don't know if this would be a good time to ask the audience, call a friend or something. Maybe some of you have some thoughts on these matters.
Okay, I'm gonna start maybe with Phoebe. She did first.
Thank you so much. Actually, my question leads on very closely to what you were just talking about, Rachel, which has to do with your methodology. And I was very interested to see you're using Fairclough and critical discourse analysis. I just was curious how you're putting that into practice. So yeah, that's my question.
So with regards to critical discourse analysis, I'm just really interested in looking at the power relations. That's why I'm looking at it in that way. So Foucauldian analysis. Trying to tease out, what are a lot of mundane reflections, but trying to understand, there's a moralization of health that seems to be occurring, and it's the way that people talk about it is fascinating if you're looking at it with regards to power relations on a state level, from the state, from like a socioeconomic and political level, but also within themselves, and the kind of contentions between what we want to do as a person and what we feel we should do in society, and also the way we talk about that as well. And often with health practice, what's really interesting is the way that people talk about their health and their body is very private. It's a very private practice. We operating in a very image, conscious culture. We all know that. We're a very visual culture now. And so the representation of our bodies and ourself has become integral to our sense of self and well-being. So the way that we then talk about that, people, I think, struggle with talking about it because it's very personal. It's about the body, it's about themselves. And so you have to try and kind of like pull away at all those kind of cultural assumptions of people wanting to, I just want to lose weight because I want to look better. You want to kind of pull it apart a little bit and see why they're doing it. And I had one interview actually for my master's work where I was speaking to a young woman in her late teens, early 20s about her health practice very generally. And I was just asking who she felt was responsible for her health, whether she felt it was herself or the state, or, the NHS, as this was in the UK. And she said that she felt that she was responsible for her health and she had to maintain it and manage it and look after herself. And I said, I kind of was teasing out this more, and I was, do you not think that there's a responsibility of a government to provide a healthcare system, and that's a level of responsibility that should be available to you within the UK? And she said, oh, not really. But then I got really ill and I went into hospital, and it was a relief because I knew the doctors could just look after me. And so I think there you kind of see that kind of tension between there's this internal discourse, this internal way of pressure, privatised pressure and individualised pressure that we're putting on ourselves. And it's only when we get put into the hands of the medical profession and the authority that comes with that we kind of let go of that responsibility. And I felt that what she said to me, the language she was using there, was kind of providing that kind of contention and issue that I think is happening and that I think is being kind of advocated by these devices, if that makes sense.
I thought both papers were great, particularly in relation to how things become meaningful. I thought it really shined through and was really good. This is a question for Joeb, and you talked at one stage about people having trust in the devices, and then you finished up by saying that it matters less what the data actually says. And to me, there's a slight contradiction there. But so what I'm wondering about is trust and how people think about trust. Do they trust the devices to get them out and running, or do they not trust the accuracy of the data, or what's the issue there?
It's not really sort of trusting the data output. It's sort of a general trust placed in the device as something that is able to help you to run, because there's been a lot of effort put into these apps. There's been engineers and some exercise people, physical trainers have been in on this process, and it's of course it also relates to many of the participants that talk about use these training apps that tells you you're going to run now for the next minute or the next 30 seconds. And actually that was also on my slide, but I didn't talk about it. Then they trust that because someone with the skills has kind of how do you say it? There's someone because there's been a physical trainer saying that I can do this, then I will be able to do this. So that is kind of where the trust lies concerning, for example, training apps and stuff. I don't know if that was sort of an answer, or if you...
Yeah.
So I thought that was a really fascinating question, and because that ties your two things together that you just said, because maybe it's like we used to have trust in we do have trust in the doctors, right? But it's become more individualized, and then we don't maybe have access to the doctors as much, I don't know, and then the app comes in, and obviously that's a really interesting possible parallel maybe. That wasn't actually the question I was going to ask, though. Can I ask another one too? Okay, so that's one question. Is there actually a parallel there between you trust the doctors, you trust the app because it's like got authority of some sense? That's one question. And then another question was really for Rachael, because you say you're writing about you're interested in health apps and stuff, but your examples so far anyway are the running apps and the sort of the healthy body who doesn't need a doctor, right? Yeah. And I was wondering about there's so many other forms of self-representation and health online. Like, there's all the sickness blogs, there's community sites like where you track fertility together, or patients like me where you write about what medicines you're taking and all this stuff, and or the experience of a diabetic person who has to track. They do very detailed health tracking, right? So there's so many other kinds of health and quantified self and digital media you could have looked at. Will you be looking at those other things as well, or are you focusing on this sort of healthy lifestyle thing?
Initially I was just really interested in looking at running applications and at digital health technology and the applications in itself, but my interest has increasingly moved away from that, and it's more about how not necessarily looking at patients or people that are trying to manage particular illnesses or issues or different aspects of their life. It's more just about how a layperson health is becoming more and more integrated into their lifestyle practices and how that's influencing their self-representation, because I feel that health is shifting so much. It's becoming so representative of different ways of being in the world. When I'm looking at representation on social media, I'm thinking about things like Instagram images, or talking about health, or talking about feeling unwell or tired or overworked, or I'm looking at health in a very broad, very, very broad sense. And I'm interested to see how the everyday person understands health. What does health mean to them now? Because it seems that it's kind of creeping and encroaching on lots of different areas of our lives where it wasn't before. Before we simply health was, good or bad health to an extent. You either you had an illness or you didn't, whereas now I feel that there's lots of different ways that we can understand health practice, and that health practice is becoming, as I've touched on before, about this moralisation of health, about becoming an active citizen and an active consumer, about making sure you're having, that, for example, in the UK, you're 5 a day, and those different kind of policies that are encouraging you to behave in certain ways. And it's making the everyday person become a lay expert to an extent, and through the devices we can kind of adopt to an extent this kind of medical gaze. We can see our body in ways that we've never been able to see it before, that only was abled by doctors and people with access to certain technologies or expertise. And so I think there is still a status and an authority that in the UK certainly that people ascribe to the medical profession, definitely. But I feel that but that's now the last resort, whereas it used to be your first resort used to be going to the GP. I think that it's shifting now, that before there's this mass kind of misinformation and information, we're kind of taught to self-diagnose and acquire all this information before we get to that point. And I think it's that issue that I'm kind of interested in exploring is how are people trying to understand whether they are in good or bad health? What does that mean to individual people?
Regarding the trust issue, I guess it's not only about trust in the individual app, it's also about that a lot of people have this fascination of technology in general. So we have kind of a general feeling that if there is a new exercise technology, we have the trust that it would help us in some way. And a lot of the participants that I interviewed, they all talks about, it's funny to pay attention to the verbs that they use when talking about technology in general, because they talk about, I stumbled upon this app, in Danish it would be fall directly to I fell upon this app. So it was like they use these verbs that it's almost like walking in the forest and picking up a stick, because they are so available, all of these kinds of apps. And we have a general fascination of technology and trust in technology. But on an individual app level, I guess that in the case of many of the training programs, there's like you have these pictures of fit people and fit physical trainers who are quoting this and that, and I guess that is sort of the way that they make us trust them on an individual level.
Because you also mentioned that they felt like there's a professional trainer in Australia who looks pretty buff, so I trust the app because he'll help me. And I was wondering, does anyone use Headspace? It's like this meditation app. Yeah. So that's exactly what that app's about. I mean, it's like this calm English voice, and he can make me meditate, I'm sure, if I just use the app and look back at my history. I mean, so there's a very personified thing. I mean, I can't remember his name, but he's got that voice, and
Andy something.
Right. But is it the app, or, I mean, is it the data or the person? Is my question, I guess. Or maybe it's a combination.
It depends on which app you use, I guess, kind of, because but it must be some kind of combination, because the app is sort of personified. But again, in the case of my participants, it's also very important that there's not another physical person present, right? So it needs to be a device, but simultaneously it also needs to have some sort of human-like status. So combination would be the answer, I guess.
Actually, maybe the reason it works is I know Andy doesn't actually see me, so it's like he's actually... Kate Crawford's done this interesting work on lurkers, and like it's listening and it's an active kind of labor, and actually maybe we like the apps because they don't hear us, but they're personal somehow. I don't know. I think that's a key thing. I think that it's quite hard, as I mentioned, talking about your body and your health. So it's hard when you go to a GP and you have to explain all that information. Whereas I think we're far more comfortable in searching online, self-diagnosis. I think we sit far comfortably in that space where we can explore all of these opportunities for ill health or good health. And yeah, that's it, I think. And there is trust
issues there, I think. And to kind of go back to your trust point, I think that my worry, what I kind of find really problematic is that people are really trusting a lot of these applications, and they're not accurate, and they're not, as was you mentioned earlier, obviously with Night Fuel, sorry, and that's my contention, is that when you're putting all of your trust and belief into a device, and you're quantifying aspects of your being, and you're pushing yourself perhaps to run further or faster or eat less because the app's told you that you've gone over your calorie consumption for X amount of days, like MyFitnessPal does, for example, that no human body can be fully quantified, and there's no one-size-fit-all model for individual users. And that's the issue, I think, is that a lot of people are just using these apps and they are trusting them, and that's potentially quite worrying, I think, in the long term, in terms of, not everybody is the same, and the apps treat everybody as though they are the same.
I just have one comment in relation to that, because I don't think that's necessarily always the case, that people are blindly trusting these apps. They are, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to use like MyFitnessPal or any kind of food tracker, because there is a constant negotiation going on between you and the app, because you know that you are not accurate yourself. You just say, well, it was about this amount of this and that, and sometimes you scale up or you scale down on different issues and stuff. So it's a much more complex relationship between you and that kind of persona, or whatever. It might be some sort of persona understanding of somebody on the other end of that line. And that, of course, also relates to whether or not you want to share with actual people, because they might come back to you and say, no, you didn't run, or why didn't you track, or whatever.
The idea around cheating that we were saying earlier.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of self-censorship that occurs within the app, so not putting in all the food that you've done. Or I've heard stories of people competing, not actually together physically, but all groups of friends trying to run a certain amount of miles a week, and some people put it and trying to be on a leaderboards, and some people just putting it on their car or their bike or something. Yeah. So I mean, of course there is aspects of it. It is a contention. It's not black and white. But
no, definitely not.
I really enjoyed both talks, and I was just thinking about, actually kind of on that point, two analytical points that you both made, which sort of came together. And Rachael used this phrase, the healthy self, which is presented online, and Joeb used this phrase, like hanging out with the datafied self, kind of waiting for the bus and looking at the data. And it kind of seemed to me almost like the datafied self is like Goffman's backstage kind of performance, and the healthy self is the sort of the filtered version, possibly literally with an Instagram filter, maybe, I don't know. That's the front stage performance, and it seemed like there was that kind of what you thought about that. If that's a kind of a workable way of thinking about that distinction.
That's really, really helpful, actually. I think because I kind of see the data as totally behind the scenes, because obviously the self-representation aspect's what really, really interests me. And how people interpret that, and how they also present it, because obviously, with all the applications, you can screenshot certain bits of it. You don't have to show everything. And I think that's quite an interesting tool. Again, that kind of ties into not cheating necessarily, but just the way it's carefully constructed. Yeah, I think the way that you can very carefully construct that idealized self. Yeah.
I think you can talk about the tracking data as some sort of backstage performance, but it's still really not backstage, because it's still available. Of course, the hanging out is a backstage performance. Oh yeah, that was what you're meaning. But it just came to think about, because one of my participants talks about sharing practices. She's not one of the ones who struggle, but she's one who exercises fairly much, actually. And she has started to track her runs, and she's become fond of doing this. But now she's actually in a dilemma, because she's also a mother of a baby boy, and she is friends with on the tracking app with a lot of the people from her mødregruppe. What's that called? Maternal group, maternal community, and suddenly she needs to she feels the need to exercise less because it becomes visible how much she is exercising. So that is that is actually tracking is not only a positive thing, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's time for some coffee. Thank you very much for the